You would think that as many times if I had to do this by now, this would be automatic, but it's not. So take your Bibles and turn to Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. And today we're going to find ourselves with Paul in Athens. I had originally intended to cover verses 16 through 34, but I find that I need to divide this into two sections, two parts. And so we could call the first part Paul's evangelism in the city, and then the second part, which we'll get to next week, Paul's evangelism in the Areopagus. And as we look at this passage, we need to remember that Paul has been escorted out of Berea, sent by boat to Athens. And that was because the unbelieving Jews from Thessalonica were chasing Paul. They were following him. They hated his message and they hated him. And remember, the message that Paul is boldly proclaiming is that the Old Testament predicted the Messiah, that he would suffer, die, and rise again, and this has been fulfilled by Jesus. Jesus is the Messiah. This is the message that Paul has been preaching. So let's look at these verses here. Let's put them all together. I'm going to read through this paragraph, verse 16 through 21, and then we'll take a closer look at the points that we see that Luke is making here. Verse 16. Now, while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Therefore, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshipers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him. And some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears. Therefore, we want to know what these things mean." For all the Athenians and the foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. So here is Paul as he is in Athens, and this is before he gets to the Areopagus and talks about the idol to the unknown God. And so this is setting the stage for that, so to speak. And if we look at verse 16 again, I want us to notice the offense of idolatry, the offense of the idolatry in Athens. It says, "Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols." And so immediately we know Paul's in Athens. Well, what do we know about Athens? Let me give you 9 things real quick that we know about Athens. Number 1, it's named after the patron goddess Athena. It has a long, long history. It goes back to at least the 13th century BC, and probably even earlier than that. Athens, this is number 3, Athens was the center of Greek art, literature, architecture, politics, and Athens was the place to be at the high point of the Greek culture, of Greek history in the 5th century BC. So while Athens was in its golden age, Malachi was writing his prophecy about the same time that we see here. Number 4, Athens was a great and mighty city, but it suffered from changes of control all the way up to the Roman period. So Athens fell in and out of the hands of different people until it comes into the hands of the Romans in about 148 BC. In Paul's day, Athens was still a significant city, but it was past its prime. It was on the downward side of history. And that's when Paul is there. It's still a major influence. It still has a big impact on Rome and its culture, and of course, on Greece. Now, in Athens, this is point 6, in Athens, there were 4 major schools of philosophy. Platonism, maybe you've heard of that. Have you ever heard of Plato? Platonism is this philosophy. Then there is peripateticism. I won't ask you to say that, but it comes from the Greek word peripateto, that means to walk, and it's another philosophy. This is the philosophy that was developed and taught by Aristotle. Have you heard of Aristotle? Okay, so we got Plato at Athens, Aristotle at Athens. Then there's the Epicureans and the Stoics, and we'll talk more about them a little bit later. At the center, point 7 here, at the center of the city, the thing around which the entire city is built is the Acropolis. And on the Acropolis, there's a bunch of temples to various gods. One of them, the Parthenon, maybe you've heard of that. It's usually when you, if you would Google Greece or ancient Greece or something like that, and you see the picture of a temple, the ruins of a temple, it's usually the Parthenon. That's what you see. And so this is in Athens on the Acropolis. There's another significant landmark there, and that's the Areopagus, Mars Hill, and it's on the western approach to the Acropolis. This city was known for its interest in information, politics, and religion. And so if there's a place to go to hear teaching, Athens is it, which I found very ironic. It's interesting that the Jews from Thessalonica are chasing Paul around because they don't like him and they don't like his message. They want to stop him and they want to squash his message. And so where do they chase him to? They chase him to the one place where everybody wants to hear his message. They don't know it, but it's new to them and they want to hear it. And so this is an amazing thing. If you want to know anything in Paul's day, the place to go, if you could, would be Athens. And so Paul ends up in Athens, this place that is hungry for information. It's hungry for ideas. It's hungry for facts. And the Lord takes him there, not by a direct route, but he has to take a roundabout way. And this is what the Lord's been doing all along in this second ministry trip of Paul. And so as we go back to verse 16 here and we look at this and we can ask the question, what is Paul doing? What is he doing? He's waiting. Now, why is he waiting? He's waiting for Silas and Timothy to rejoin him. Remember, they're back at Berea. They did not leave with Paul. Paul went by himself, and so he's waiting for Silas and Timothy to rejoin him. And as I was looking at this, I was reading, my thought came to my mind, where's Luke? Where's Luke? Remember, Paul picked up Luke in Troas. And so Luke traveled with Paul and his team to Philippi. When you get to Philippi, Luke kind of drops off the scene. And we know from the way that he records these passages, Luke is actually at Philippi. He's at Philippi, and we're not going to connect back up to Luke until Paul goes back to Philippi. So Luke is going to stay in Philippi for a long period of time. But he's not with them there. So it's just Paul at Athens, and Silas and Timothy are still at Berea as we read here in our text. And so while Paul was waiting, verse 16 tells us something happened. Verse 16 tells us that his spirit was provoked within him when he saw the city was given over to idols, when the city was basically full of idols. This word provoked here has the basic meaning, to be sharpened. To be sharpened. And here it has the sense of someone poking Paul with a sharp object. That's the sense of it. But it's in his spirit. It's not physically. It's in his spirit. So imagine this. This word provoked is the idea that if you get something in your shoe that's poking you in your foot, so every time you step, you feel it. That's what's happening to Paul in his heart as he's walking around the city of Athens and he's seeing all these idols. Just like somebody's taking a sharp stick and poking him every time he sees an idol. And Paul is provoked because of the idolatry of the city. And what is idolatry? It is false worship. And false worship is one of the greatest offenses to God. Hold your finger here and turn to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. Let us remind ourselves of the basic offense that men have committed against God. Romans chapter 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. They have it, but they suppress it. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. So God can be known because he has revealed himself. Verse 20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power, the eternality and the all-powerfulness of God can be seen from the very beginning of creation. That is before the Bible was written. You don't need the Bible to understand the eternality of God and his power. They're clearly seen. And the Godhead. The Godhead. The fact that there is a Trinity can be seen, which is, to me, it's amazing. So that they, talking about men, are without excuse. Verse 21. Because, why are they without excuse? They are without excuse because although they knew God, the idea that they knew about God, they did not glorify him as God. So they knew God, they knew about God, but they did not treat him as God. They didn't treat him as if he is the supreme being, the creator of the universe. Nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their hearts, foolish hearts, were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Notice verse 23. And changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man. Throughout Athens, there were all sorts of images to man that looked like man. All over the place. And changed the glory of the incorruptible God into the image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and even creeping things. So men didn't stop at just turning themselves into God. They turned in animals and birds into gods to worship. And it says in the very next verse, therefore, God also gave them up, or gave them over to uncleanness. As men have not recognized God as God, one of the things that happens is they are turned over to any imagination that their mind can think up. The sin that Paul is talking about here in the beginning of this passage is the sin of false worship. It's the sin of idolatry, where God is not looked at as God, he's not recognized as God, and so God is replaced by whatever we can come up with our own imaginations. This is what is happening in Athens. So let's turn back to our passage in Acts chapter 17. This is what provokes Paul. This is the thing that is taking that stick and poking Paul in his heart, in his conscience, when he sees that the city is full of idols. He sees that this city is full of people who have changed the incorruptible God for corruptible images of man and of animals. This is exactly the thing that is bothering Paul, the sin of this city. So let me ask you a question. Does sin offend you? And if it does, why does it? Just because you don't like what somebody else is doing? Oh, that's a sin. I don't like that. That offends me. Or is it because that sin is an offense to God? Because the sin of idolatry says God is not God. When sin happens, whether it's in our life or someone else, behind the activity, behind that sin, whatever it may be, there is this underlying idea that God is not who he says he is. Behind every sin, there is this thought. You might not think it consciously, but you sin because you don't take God at his word. Sin in general should offend us, but in particular, our own sins should offend us even more because it defames and denigrates our God. That's what happens when we sin. Let me ask you another question. What provokes you? What provokes you? The thing that provokes Paul is sin. But what I see most often is the thing that provokes us is a tweet, is a Facebook post, a political ad on TV or something like that. Chaos in our country. That is what most often provokes us. When's the last time that sin provoked you? When's the last time that the wickedness of our country provoked you? Far too many of us are easily provoked by political issues, but we hardly feel anything when we see sin all around us. We're more sensitive to political stuff than we are to sin, and that is to our shame. And so we need to be offended by sin. And sin needs to provoke us. It needs to bother us. When we see sin, whether it's in our life or in the lives of someone else, it should be like a pointy stick jabbing in our side over and over and over again. And what's the proper response to being provoked? The proper response is to act. And we see this in verse 17 in Paul's ministry in Athens. It says in this verse, therefore, because he was provoked in his spirit by the idolatry of the city, therefore, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshipers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. So what did Paul do? He reasoned with these people. This is the same word that we found in chapter 17, this chapter, verse 2. And it's describing Paul's pattern of ministry. He reasoned with people. He had a dialogue with people. He had a conversation with people about the Bible, about the gospel, about who Jesus is. And so that's what he's doing. Now, where did he do it? Look at your verse here, verse 17. Where did he conduct this ministry? It says, in the synagogue, then jump to the second half of the verse, and in the marketplace. So he conducted this ministry in two places. In the synagogue, this is the place where people are actually thinking about God. They're actually focused on God. So he's conducting ministry there. And secondly, he's conducting ministry in the marketplace. And this is the place where everybody is thinking about everything else but God. Let me ask you a question. When you go to the grocery store, Do you go in there and say, I'm going to worship God? No, you go in there to do what? Get groceries. That's the marketplace. When you go to Walmart or whatever store, you're going there, you got something on your mind that you're going to get. So it's just natural that in the marketplace, in general, nobody's thinking about God. They're thinking about everything else but God. And so Paul's ministry is conducted in the place where they're thinking about God. They have an interest in God. They're focused on God. And it's conducted in the place where there's no interest and no focus on God. But notice, even though these are different places, Paul's ministry model stays the same. He reasons in both of these places. Now, we know what he did. We know where he did it. Now, who did he do it with? Who did he conduct this ministry with? What's it say in our passage? It says, with the Jews and with the Gentile worshipers, or just the worshipers, and it's understood that they're Gentiles. And this happened in the synagogue. But notice what it says at the end of the verse about his ministry in the marketplace. It says, with those who happen to be there. Let me put that another way for you. With anyone who was there, anyone and everyone who happens to be there, Paul's going to have a conversation with them about Jesus Christ. He's going to use the Bible, and he's going to tell them how Jesus Christ is the Savior. That's what Paul's going to do. Whether it's in the synagogue or it's in the marketplace, that is Paul's ministry. That is his message. It doesn't matter who you are. That's what Paul's going to do. And we see how often he does this there in the second part of the verse. It says, in the marketplace daily. And the emphasis here is wherever he's at in the marketplace, it doesn't matter. He is going to talk about Jesus Christ. So the picture we're getting here is that Paul's doing what Paul normally did. When he goes to the city, if there's a synagogue, guess where he goes? He goes to the synagogue. He has a discussion with people about the Old Testament, what it says about the Messiah, and that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Messiah. But he doesn't let his ministry just be limited to the people who might be interested in what he has to say. He also takes his ministry to the marketplace, and he engages those who are culturally different from him. They're different from him. He goes to the marketplace and he engages them. And so when Paul looked out and he saw the wickedness of the city all around him, what did he do? He didn't say, man, look how wicked they are. He didn't complain about it. He didn't separate from it. He took the gospel to them and he engaged them with the message of salvation. And so what do when we see wickedness of our world? Do we just complain about it? Do we just talk about how bad people are? At a minimum, at least we recognize it and say, this is wickedness. We do know what wickedness is. But then do you go on to engage these people with a gospel conversation? How many of us do everything but that? We see the wickedness all around us. We know it's wrong. We know it's not right. But the last thing we want to do is talk to somebody about the Lord. We talk about the weather. We talk about people we know. We talk about our health issues. We talk about politics. But the one thing that we want to stay away from is a spiritual conversation. But let me tell you, what you talk about reveals where your heart's at. It reveals what is important to you. And so if the Lord is important to you, we need to be talking about him with people all around us, not just at church. We'll call this our synagogue, but in the marketplace, in our community. We need to be talking to people about the Lord. And so we see Paul's ministry here in Athens. It's just like the ministry he's had in other places up to this time. But I want us to notice as we move on to verse 18 here, the confused curiosity of the elite here in Athens. There's a confused curiosity. They're confused, but they're curious. I'm sure you've experienced that somewhere along the line where something happens, somebody says something, and you're like, well, that doesn't sound right, but I'm curious about what else do they have to say. So this is happening here in Athens. Notice what it says in verse 18. Then certain Epicureans and Stoic philosophers encountered him. And some said, what does this babbler want to say? Others said, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. So in order to understand the confusion that's expressed here in this verse, we need to understand who Paul encountered and what they were thinking. And so who did Paul encounter? He encountered philosophers. These people are deep thinkers. You know, a philosopher is simply someone who has a way of looking at life, a way of looking at the world. They have a systemized idea about how the world should function. And so in a real respect, all of us are philosophers in some way because we all have a view of the world and how it ought to function and how it ought to work. But in Athens, there were four dominant worldviews. There were four dominant ways of looking at the world. We mentioned them by name earlier. And so Paul encounters these people who are the top thinkers of their day. They're the intellectual elites. These are the educated people. Now, what were they thinking? What were they thinking? We know who they are, but what were they thinking? And we have two kinds of philosophers that are specifically mentioned here, the Epicureans and the Stoics. And if you're like me, when you first look at this, you have no idea what these people thought. So you have to go study it and look it up. Well, let me tell you about the Epicureans. I'll try to boil this down to a nutshell. The Epicureans believed that the greatest good in life, the chief good in life, is pleasure, not unadulterated pleasure. They did not believe in the saying, if it feels good, do it. That's not the type of pleasure that they were talking about. They said pleasure must be understood in moderation, that you enjoy things, you get pleasure from things in moderation, and that anything that's unnecessary or artificial should be avoided. You know, some people do things to artificially bring themselves pleasure. Some people take drugs, some people drink alcohol, some people go to sports games or something, but they're trying to artificially instill pleasure into their life. And anything like that is to be avoided. This is what the Epicureans would say. They would also say that the most important pleasure to achieve is the pleasure of the mind, not the pleasure of the body. So we're not talking about bodily pleasure, we're talking about pleasures of the mind and thinking. And how is this pleasure achieved? It is achieved by having freedom from pain and death. Freedom from pain and death. Keep that in mind because that's going to be important later. So this is what the Epicureans say. You need to have pleasure. Avoid pain, suffering. Don't think about death. The Stoics, they're a little bit different. The Stoics believe that humans should be free from passions, emotions, be unmoved by either joy or grief. Have that stiff upper lip. Have you ever heard the expression, well, that person's stoic, or they handled that stoically, or something like that? And it's talking about they didn't show any emotion. They were just flat-faced, no expression at all on them. This is Stoicism. They believed that everything was determined by the divine will, and that since everything is determined, you can't change anything. And so there's no point in getting overly excited. There's no point in getting emotional because you can't change a thing. You can't do anything. You just have to go with it. They would say the greatest goal in life is to be self-sufficient, living with dignity and pride. You ever hear anything like that? That's a part of the American way.